Hi everyone, my name's Kirsty Anderson and I'm the Principal Manager of Public Engagement for the Global CCS Institute, and it's also my great privilege to be your host for today's webinar. So first, let me give a warm welcome to everyone that's tuning in from different time zones around the globe. And there has been a really large amount of interest in this webinar, and I know that there are a number of people over in Australia, Japan, China and Taiwan that have stayed out very late this Monday, especially because they're hoping to have a first-hand update of the progress that's being made in the UK on the deployment of carbon capture and storage. So you're not going to be disappointed, because this morning I'm joined by one of the best positioned people in the UK to be able to give this update, and that's the Deputy Director of the Office of Carbon Capture and Storage for the UK Department of Energy and Climate Change, Amy Clemetshaw. And this is Amy here, and Amy's been Deputy Director at the UK Office of Carbon Capture and Storage throughout this last watershed year for CCS technology. And it's a time of really exciting developments for the technology in the UK, but also for CCS on the world stage, where the UK government are becoming an increasingly important and influential advocate for low carbon technologies and future climate commitments. So in previous roles at the Department for Environment, at the Department of Food and Rural Affairs, the Cabinet Office and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Amy's worked on policies to promote more sustainable waste management in the UK, also on the UK's approach to economic and energy sector development in the Middle East, and on multilateral negotiations at the EU and UN. So now CCS deployment in the UK has perhaps not been as fast as was once hoped for. However, at the heart of the UK CCS story is a world-leading policy and regulatory approach to establish a holistic framework for CCS commercialisation, encompassing much more than just a large-scale demonstration of the technology. And I'm very pleased that Amy has agreed to join us today to give an update on UK progress and hopefully to share some of the learning and experiences so far in trying to create a supportive environment for CCS deployment. Now, I've just got a couple of last-minute housekeeping things to run through. So this session is being recorded and it will be made available on the Institute website within the next week for you to listen again or to pass on to friends. However, the big benefit of you dialing in live today is that you get the opportunity to ask questions. And we don't just welcome questions throughout the presentation, we encourage them. So it's really very simple to upload your questions via the Questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel that you can see in this picture. So hopefully you can see my mouse moving around here. And I'm going to be moderating these questions as we go, but because we do have a particularly large audience today, if there are too many to fit into the one session, then we will try and follow up with you after the webinar. So now, without any further ado, let me hand over to Amy. Thanks, Amy.
Thanks, Kirsty, for inviting me to speak today. It's really great to be here, and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to share this update with your members and those around the world who have an interest in CCS and in our CCS programme. As many of you will know, the UK is one of the most active programmes of any country globally on CCS, and that really reflects the importance that we attach to this mitigation technology. There's a number of reasons why we're investing so heavily, despite the fact that CCS is in the early stages as a commercially deployable technology. But that's because essentially we think it has the potential to make a unique contribution to managing the energy trilemma of sustainability, affordability and security. This slide kind of just summarises that, and let me explain a little bit more about how we see the challenge. On sustainability, here in the UK we've got a demanding domestic legal target for greenhouse gas reductions. That's to reduce them by 80% by 2050, and we think CCS is going to be very important to allow us to make those deep cuts in emissions. It's obviously very important in the power sector, and if anything, even more important for us or any country that seeks to decarbonise industrial processes such as steel making. Second, on affordability, our ministers have to pay close attention to the costs of climate change mitigation, and we need to decarbonise our economy in a way that minimises those costs to the taxpayer and the consumer of energy. Independent experts at the Energy Technologies Institute have calculated that CCS could cut the cost of meeting our 2050 target by as much as £32 billion per year by 2050. And you can imagine that's a really substantial saving, and it's because CCS allows you to avoid doing other things that would be more expensive. On security, CCS could allow us to keep fossil fuels in our energy mix with the benefits that they can bring, but without the dangerous emissions. And those benefits are really important from an energy system perspective. They provide flexible capacity to complement energy sources that are inflexible or intermittent. And in terms of resilience, they would allow us to keep using, for example, domestic reserves of gas in the long term, as well as coal. And then finally, we see potential for the future CCS industry to act as an engine for jobs and growth. So we think we've got a good policy and regulatory framework, which I will discuss in a bit more detail in this presentation. But hopefully this slide shows that others agree with that. The GCCSI, in fact, have made an independent assessment of the policy environment for CCS. And as this infographic on the slide shows, we were ranked second only to Norway globally in terms of the enabling nature of our policy framework, and also with a healthy number of projects in the pipeline. So let me summarise the key components of that framework. And many of the components summarised here support both power and industrial CCS, and others are specific to one or the other. There's 5 key strands. First, we've ensured that the necessary regulation is in place to enable CCS deployment. That includes handling of technical issues, such as how to ensure that CO2 is safely stored, as well as regulation to more directly influence the decisions of investors in energy infrastructure. And I'll come on to this and the other components in a bit more detail shortly. Second, we have a mechanism to give CCS plants access to operating support to make sure they have a reliable revenue stream to cover the cost of their initial investment. We put this in place through the Electricity Market Reform Programme, and specifically the Feedin Tariff Contract for Difference, or CFD. And we're currently negotiating a CFD that's tailored to the requirements of CCS. Third, we have a dedicated CCS competition that's focused on commercialising the technology at scale. And this competition includes competitive award of up to £1 billion of capital support for construction of CCS. Fourth, we're investing heavily in CCS research and development and innovation, because we think that can really help reduce risk and lower the cost of CCS technologies over time. And to date, we and our partners have invested £130 million since 2011. Finally, we want to share the learning from our projects and really influence the international environment for CCS. The learning takes place in many ways, and principally through an active programme of knowledge transfer from the projects currently going through front-end engineering and design, or FEED, with UK government support. And we're also taking steps specifically targeted at the role of CCS in heavy industry, with a £1 million pre-FEED study that's looked at how CCS could operate on an industrial cluster in the Tees Valley area of the UK. The following slides will unpack some of these elements in a bit more detail. So let's start with policy and regulation. and specifically how we handle the fact that coal and gas without CCS are currently a really substantial part of our energy mix, but over time we want to see that change. Our ministers have been clear that the future of coal power in the UK is dependent on CCS, and we put in place measures to ensure that no new coal-fired power stations are built in the UK that don't have CCS. We call this the policy triple lock. That starts with an emissions performance standard, which is in legislation. That has set the level of emissions from a fossil fuel powered station at a level that is lower than even the most efficient coal, but higher than gas. So that is one way in which we've ensured that a new unabated coal station would not be able to operate. Second, we use the planning system to ensure that any new coal-fired power station that's built has to have 300 megawatts of full chain CCS in place in order to operate and to get planning permission, indeed, to build. And third, we have a policy of carbon price support, because we think carbon pricing is really important in driving investor decisions in energy technologies. At the moment, the floor for the carbon price in the UK is £18 per tonne for the next 4 years, and we project that to rise to £70 by 2030. So that's the policy triple lock that we've put in place around coal-fired power. Gas is a little bit different. Obviously, with half the emissions of coal, we see unabated gas playing a role in our energy mix in the medium term. But in order to meet longer term targets, we know we will need CCS on gas too. And we want to avoid locking in emissions, given that plants that are built now or over the next few years are going to operate for some time. So for that reason, we stipulate that any new gas plant has to be built carbon capture ready. And that means that they have to be able to demonstrate before they get planning permission that it's technically and economically feasible to retrofit CCS onto their plant in future. Now let me turn to our support for CCS through electricity market reform. Our support policy for CCS is really integrated into a broader vision for the direction of the electricity market in the UK. With many plants approaching the end of their operational life, the UK is going to require billions of pounds of new investment in energy over the next 15 years. The government has acted to ensure that the incentives are in place for this investment to take place in low carbon sources, such as renewables, CCS and nuclear, as well as gas. These changes have been delivered through the Electricity Market Reform Programme, in which the key mechanism is the contract for difference. The CFD provides revenue certainty for developers by guaranteeing to top up the price at which they sell electricity in the wholesale market to a pre-agreed strike price. A generic CFD is already in place, and that was developed through in a renewables context, and we're currently negotiating the first CFD with CCS developers through the CCS competition, and that will obviously include some tailoring to reflect the nature of CCS technology. Now, a preferred approach is not to set targets for deployment, because we know we'll need to get well into the 2020s before we can really see how the costs of different technologies are evolving, how they've fallen or not. But in our EMR delivery plan, we envisage deployment of CCS in the power sector, potentially up to 13 gigawatts by 2030, in a scenario that would see high deployment of CCS, and in a medium deployment scenario, 5 gigawatts. Now let me cover the CCS competition, because this is really at the heart of our current focus on CCS. In addition to that operating support through the CFD, we recognise that the construction phase of CCS is exceptionally high risk and capital intensive at the moment. And that's why we launched the CCS competition in 2012 with £1 billion of capital support on offer. As many of you will know, the two preferred bidders in the competition were announced in 2013, and they are the Peterhead project, led by Shell with SSE in Aberdeenshire, and the White Rose project, led by the Capture Power Limited consortium in Yorkshire. How are these projects doing? Well, both of them are currently completing their front-end engineering and design studies, which we, the UK government, is co-funding with the project developers. And once these FEED studies are complete, we and they will have the information needed to take a final investment decision. Now, depending on the final shape of these project proposals and the value for money they offer, the government may decide to support one, both, or neither into construction. And that has to be a decision taken at the end of the process when the best information is available on what those projects offer and at what cost. Around 100 million of the capital grant is allocated to the FEED studies, with the remainder available to support construction costs of any project that proceeds to that stage. And in parallel with this FEED work, we're negotiating contracts for difference with each of the bidders, as I've said. The map on this slide shows both competition projects, and it also shows some of the other important CCS projects underway in the UK. The Don Valley CCS project, led by Sargas, is supported by a grant from the EU's European Energy Recovery Programme. Another one up in Scotland, you have the Caledonia Clean Energy Project in Grangemouth. That's led by Summit Power and is receiving some support from the Scottish Government and from DEC to support early industrial R&D on that project. And the Teesside project, which, as I've mentioned, is a proposed industrial CCS cluster that could capture CO2 from steel, ammonia and other industrial sources, and where we have funded some pre-FEED work to look at how that could work in practice. Let me tell you a little bit more about the two competition projects. Here you can see some details on White Rose, which is led by the consortium made up of Drax, Alstom and BOC Linde, working with National Grid. At 448 megawatts equivalent, it's a commercial scale project that could produce enough low carbon electricity to power 630,000 homes. They're proposing to use oxy-fuel capture technology on a new coal-fired plant at Drax and could capture 2 million tonnes of CO2 per year. Now, this project proposes oversized CO2 transport and storage, so it could provide the capacity for further capture projects in the region. And it's proposing to store the CO2 in a saline aquifer underneath the North Sea. The Peterhead project is also a full-chain commercial-scale CCS project with a proposed capacity of 340 megawatts. What Peterhead would propose to do is to retrofit post-combustion CCS capture to an existing gas power plant, and they could power 500,000 homes. Peterhead could capture and store 1 million tonnes of CO2 per year in the Goldeneye depleted gas field, which also has excess capacity. So those are both really exciting project proposals, and between the two FEED studies, we're investigating a number of different options for CCS. 2 different types of capture, 2 different storage methods, different fuel types, and different construction plans, one a retrofit and one a new build. And that's important to help maximise the learning for the international CCS community from these two FEED studies. Now on timing, the competition process is still very much underway, and this timeline shows where we're up to now. FEED began over a year ago and is well advanced, and negotiations on the contract for difference and the project contract that would govern any capital grant that's awarded alongside a CFD are underway. Later this year, we expect to ask the companies to submit their final bids to government based on their own assessments of the projects and final investment decisions taken internally in the company. And following that, government will take its own investment decision in early 2016. And I should note that running alongside this is the state aid process, because of course will require approval from the European Commission for both the award of a capital grant and operating support to these projects. And any project that had a positive final investment decision and subject to state aid approval, we'd expect to see proceed to construction in 2016. Now looking ahead to the future a little bit, obviously the competition has not yet concluded, but we're already giving thought to how we could build on the outcomes of the competition to continue to develop CCS in the UK. This slide highlights where we are now and where CCS in the UK could go in future. Let's focus on the blue parts of this diagram first. By supporting up to 2 full chain projects, the competition is designed to lay down anchor infrastructure along the full CCS chain, capture, transport and storage. This is shown in blue on the slide, and you could think of this as the phase 1 of CCS in the UK. The elements in pink show how this anchor infrastructure could lay the foundation for further development of CCS into a second phase of CCS deployment. And I draw attention in particular to a couple of things. The first is part chain capture projects. Now there's a lot of analysis done that shows that efficient sharing of infrastructure is a really key way in which the cost of CCS could be reduced. And we see potential for clusters of CCS capture projects sharing transport and storage infrastructure in future. The second is industrial CCS. As I've noted, CCS is the only way to decarbonise sectors such as steel and cement making. And we know that it will be important to substantially decarbonise these sectors if the world is to stay on track to a 2-degree scenario. There are other areas highlighted here with the potential in the future. They include enhanced oil recovery, where we could use the CO2 to maximise recovery of oil and gas from our own reserves in the North Sea, and broader carbon capture and utilisation. Both of these would create a value proposition for the captured CO2. And also CCS on biomass or bioenergy, which could generate negative emissions power. That could be useful in reducing the need for action in other sectors that are more difficult and more expensive to decarbonise. So while concluding the competition is an immediate task ahead of us, and a really substantial and complex one with a way left to go, we're also focused on where CCS could move in future and what role government could play in incentivising further projects. I'll leave it there, so we've got some time for questions, and I'm looking forward to a discussion. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Amy, thank you so much. Okay, we have had a number of questions coming through thick and fast, Amy, so I'm going to do my best to rattle through them before we wind up in the next half hour. So let's just kick off, if you're okay to start, with the first question, which is around, you've mentioned a couple of times in the presentation about the knowledge sharing programme that the UK government are running in conjunction with the two FEED study projects with White Rose and Peterhead. So I've had a couple of questions asking various things about how is that knowledge sharing programme operating, and where can people access the information from those FEED studies?
Sure. Knowledge transfer is absolutely integral to how we've designed the competition. As you can imagine, we're investing a lot of public money in these projects, and we really believe that one of the benefits should be accessible and widely disseminated learning to help build understanding and confidence of CCS internationally. We actually launched the competition's knowledge transfer programme a few weeks ago when we published the first learning documents from the FEED studies. When we negotiated the FEED contracts, we had it absolutely built in that there was a requirement for the developers to produce learning in an accessible and shareable format as part of their contractual obligation, and also to back this up with participation in learning events such as conferences and seminars. And it's really a great thing for us that we are now in a position to start publishing those documents. We've uploaded the first set of documents onto the government's CCS website, and they can be found there by anyone. If you Google UK CCS knowledge transfer, that should get you there, but they're on our gov.uk site. Over the remaining FEED time, each project will be publishing a number of learning documents on a range of different aspects of the FEED studies. Those include technical elements such as the subsurface and well engineering, the power and the capture plant and how that would operate and transport, as well as the more commercial aspects of the project and the project management. And they'll be published and up as soon as they're ready to go. So I hope that over time we'll build up a real knowledge library on these projects that is accessible to all.
Brilliant, thanks Amy. And I think it's entirely feasible for us to send out a link to the knowledge transfer documents on the DEC website when we put further information out from this webinar, so we can do that for everyone.
Great.
Brilliant. Amy, I've had quite a few questions on two areas, on CFDs and also on gas, so I'm going to try and group them together, starting with gas. And if this is too technical a question, then we can defer it, but let's give it a bash. So the first one was, how do you demonstrate on a gas plant with CCS, how do you demonstrate that a gas plant with CCS is economically feasible in the future, if that is going to require a number of assumptions being made about the price on CO2? And a similar question was about, is there plans or intentions in the UK to have a rollout of an emissions performance standard for gas in the future?
Thank you. Let me start with the first one, the emissions performance standard. As I noted in the presentation, that's currently set at a level that rules out coal but not gas. And that's because we really believe that gas does have an important role to play in the medium term in the energy mix. It's a lot cleaner than coal, and it has a number of benefits, including its flexibility and its ability to respond to rapid changes in demand. There are no current plans to create an emissions performance standard for gas in the UK. Of course, I can't preempt here where we may be in the future, and we have been really clear that in the long term, we do think that to stay on trajectory to limiting climate change to 2 degrees, you do need to use CCS on gas in the power sector as well. But there'll be a range of different tools that you could use to get you there. And an emissions performance standard and that regulatory approach is only one potential such tool. So no current plans, a focus on gas, unabated gas at the moment, but a clear commitment to CCS gas in the future, and let's see what looks like the best way to get there. On the other question on gas and assumptions around the carbon price, I mean, in a sense, the same applies to coal. We have to base all our investment decisions on assumptions around how future markets will develop. That includes the European ETS market, which puts a price on carbon. It includes global, commodity markets, including coal, and of course the gas price. I think our desire to demonstrate that CCS works on gas is to really develop a proof of concept here in the UK that CCS gas works, and over the life of the CFD, you have to make a reasonable set of assumptions around future market prices.
Brilliant, Amy, thank you. And just on the CFDs, so we've had a number of questions, and I think maybe it's just a case of some clarification, because I think you have covered most of this in the presentation. But I've had people asking about the timing that's involved for next generation CCS, so not the demonstration projects, but for those next up and coming CCS projects, will they still be able to benefit from a CFD? And also asking about whether CFDs are being designed to recognise the different stages of development of the technology.
Sure. I mean, starting with the future CCS projects, we, as I said in the presentation, we do want to think beyond the competition. I should stress that there's a long way to run on the competition, and a lot of work to put into that yet before we get to the right outcome. But we do want to think ahead, and ministers have been really clear on that. That's one of the reasons we published a document last year called Next Steps in CCS that really allowed us to describe in detail the different areas that will need to come to the fore in developing a broader CCS industry and a pipeline of projects in the UK. And in that document, we acknowledge that while the competition will hammer out the first CFD for CCS and provide a template for how the CFD would work with a CCS project, we also need to be thinking about how that will evolve over time and how future CFDs may be allocated to further projects depending on how the competition goes. And so we're doing a lot of work on that with a view to concluding it in 2016, and by then having a much clearer sense of what the CFD offer would be to a further post-competition CCS project. And of course, we're working within a cross-government context, and there's budget setting processes. As you can imagine, there's a lot of that underway at the moment because we're in the early stages of a new parliament and a new government. And so those cross-government decisions will also be an important part of the framework for future CCS deployment.
And I think also, Amy, it's probably worth pointing out for people not so familiar with UK policy and how the CFD system works, that the CFDs are not just a system for CCS, that it is an incentive mechanism for all your low carbon technologies, right?
That's right. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. It's we've tried to create a framework that can support renewable technologies, CCS, and nuclear, because we're going to need all of those in the long term.
Great, thanks, Amy. Amy, the other area that I've had a clump of questions around is around industrial CCS in the UK and the work that, or the investments certainly that are being made in that area. Specifically, I've had two different questions coming in about what the next steps are for the Teesside project that you mentioned, that you said it was a pre-FEED study that had been funded. So we've had questions about what are the next steps for that, and are the UK government involved?
Sure. I mean, in a sense, that's a timely question, although I would stress that it's fairly early days. We know that based on the current technology landscape, CCS would be really important to decarbonise the industrial sectors, and that's why we've been looking at how it could be done there. The Tees Valley report is a really important component of that. They've looked at how industrial CCS could be used in 4 industrial sectors, and they've developed options for how investment in it could take place. That report was launched just last week, and we're at the stage now of kind of taking receipt of that from the team in Teesside, having them explain to us their findings, talk us through the big conclusions that they've drawn, and then obviously we've got a new set of ministers and they're going to want to consider that closely. It is a challenging area because, as we know at the moment, the European carbon price isn't currently strong enough to drive decarbonisation in these sectors, and it's not likely to be for some time. And then, even if it were, we need to recognise that the kind of products produced in these sectors are globally traded in many cases. So without an international carbon price, you need to think about the effects on competitiveness of any domestic action that you take to support industrial CCS. And those are big policy questions that need thinking about in the round, and I know our ministers are going to want to do that, but it's really, really positive and valuable to have this in-depth look from Tees Valley about how different incentives could be structured there. I think we need to take that away and essentially learn from what they have investigated before we come up with any firm next steps.
Thanks, Amy. And again, worth saying that there is the Tees Valley group have a webinar which is on the website that people can listen to if they're interested in that industrial sector and these findings, and the report was published last week. So there are easy to access links to those reports and findings and the work that's come out from the Teesside Collective. Amy, a slightly different question. This one is around about learning from the FEED projects in particular, but generally from your work on CCS. And this is a question that's come out from one of the academic groups in Australia. So they've been asking if, as you've been working through CCS policy development and working with these different power sector projects, what have you learned about the different ways that social and technical risks are navigated in the different sectors? So they're looking specifically at gas, coal, electricity, and have you found that there's real differences in terms of how these sectors handle risks?
That's an interesting question, and I mean, I will assume that by social risks, is this talking about the risk of social safety, consent, acceptance of CCS deployment? I mean, I think on social risk, every country has quite a specific context, I think, on public opinion and public attitudes to infrastructure and energy sector deployment. In the UK, CCS is currently a much lower profile issue than, for example, the development of shale gas onshore, or the development of or the use of some renewable technologies, including onshore wind. And we found that a lot of the most important risk management in terms of consent and acceptance really happens at a very local level, led by actors who understand the priorities of the community that lives around the infrastructure and how best to engage with them. So both our projects that are in Feed, White Rose and Peterhead are obviously closely engaged with the communities around them, and there's been some really positive, I think, work done with those communities, and that has borne fruit, certainly insofar as, you know, so far the decisions by the local authorities have been to support the project. Whether different sectors manage that in different ways, I'm not sure I could say, but certainly our experience from those two projects is that you do need to do it locally. There is, of course, a role for government in setting a national tone and leading a national debate on the changes that we need to see in the energy sector, and I think that's where our ministers and our engagement with Parliament and our broader public and media engagement become really important.
Brilliant.
I've gone into less detail on the technical risk management because I think that's something where we're very much, the developers are a lot closer to the technical operation of those projects, and our contractual relationship with them is designed such that they have the space to investigate and manage those risks. But there's less of a direct role for government there, because they are effectively the owners of that infrastructure.
Yeah, they're the experts that are reporting into you.
Yeah.
Amy, is it just worth clarifying as well? I've had a couple of questions from people just asking about the storage options. Now, I'm assuming from this question that they're asking about the storage options for the Feed project. The specific question was, are the projects close to confirming storage options? So I think it's possibly just worth clarifying that the information that you had put out about the Feed projects and the storage sites that they are there, and also that they a lot of information on those two storage sites for the Feed projects will be available through the knowledge deliverables that are being released throughout this year. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. That is certainly the case. The subsurface and well engineering aspects of Feed do feature in the knowledge transfer programme. So, over the course of the next year or so, we'll be making information progressively available as the work is done in Feed on that. In terms of the two stores themselves, I mean, they're obviously very different insofar as the Goldeneye reservoir is already well characterised because it's a gas reservoir that had an active life, as it were. So that site is well understood as a result of that. The White Rose project is looking at a saline aquifer that is, by its nature, less well known, so there's more of a task involved in characterising and appraising that, and that is an important part of the storage component of the White Rose Feed, is precisely doing that. And I should add, Kirsty, just going back to a previous question, I realise I didn't respond fully to the question around next generation CCS technologies. I mean, I think there all I would say is, obviously technology can move really fast, or it can't, but certainly you expect technical and technology evolution to take place, and that's one of the things that we're supporting through our R&D funding, is the development of different technologies for CCS. We quite deliberately, in the design of the competition, were entirely neutral on the CCS technology proposal, and that's something we learned really from our previous experience in supporting CCS projects. We want to leave that open and see what the market put forward by way of CCS technology. And, obviously we'll need to take stock of that in any future support mechanism that's offered, but developing newer and potentially cheaper CCS technologies is a really important part of the effort.
Thanks, Amy. I was actually about to pick up with you because a question that we had sort of further developing on that was from the UK government's point of view, what were the kind of key learnings that you've had in trying to establish this commercialisation programme, and they were specifically interested in your decision to invest in R&D and where that had come from. Is there anything else that you want to add onto that, just about the amount of funding that the UK are putting into R&D and continue to put in?
I think I'd just say that R&D is really critical. There's a huge debate to have about what role the government should play and what role the market should play in technologies that are at or approaching commercial deployability. But when you're looking at earlier stage R&D, I think it's very clear that there's a role for government there in funding that level of research, because in the longer term it's going to be absolutely necessary. So future R&D funding is something that we'll be discussing as part of broader budget discussions across government over the next year, but I envisage that continuing to be a really important part of what we do. And we work with obviously research councils and other major funders of R&D in the UK.
Great. Amy, I've got a slightly tricky question I think is worth asking, just so that we can get some clarification on it, and then one more as well. So this one was about, it has been reported recently in the press that the government is to withdraw green energy subsidies to put all power generation on an even footing. Is this true, and if so, how can investors in CCS and renewable energy sources be able to plan without a predictable minimum energy price for carbon-free or carbon-reducing technologies?
Okay. I'm not sure exactly which press report that's referring to, but I can certainly set out kind of the current situation within government. We have a new government at the moment. We're a few weeks into the new parliament since the election in May, and obviously the Conservatives set out some of their priorities in their manifesto pre-election, which is going to be the starting point, obviously, for designing their programme of government over the next 5 years, but by no means the end point. And of course, as many of you will know, they made an explicit reference to CCS in that manifesto and the competition. Ministers have taken decisions on the support offered to some elements of renewable technology, principally onshore wind, since they took office in May, and that essentially is a straightforward implementation of the commitment they gave in the manifesto to not provide further subsidy to onshore wind farms, and to ensure that the process for deciding to build one left the final decision in the hands of the local community that would be hosting that project. And that's quite a specific shift in approach on onshore wind that doesn't sort of apply across the energy piece. In terms of the question of certainty and transparency, clearly that's important, and that's one of the reasons why the Conservatives were very clear in their manifesto what their intention was, and on taking office have essentially implemented that in a way that would be expected from the commitments they'd made beforehand. But we're really aware that the development of an industry does not happen overnight, and the development of a project is a long and painstaking process with a real lead-in time, and that's one of the reasons why we're doing as much as we can to think ahead to what will be needed beyond the competition, even though necessarily it will take a while to put that in place.
Great, and I've had a clarification through from the person who asked the question saying that it was in reference to some of the wind farm energy decisions, so thanks Amy for picking up on that one. The other sort of wider question that I've had coming in was about the UK government and CCS and what you're doing internationally in terms of the run-up to COP21 in Paris this year, and are there plans, will CCS feature within the UK government's approach to COP21, or generally, you know, what is the UK government's position, and where are you going with your work on that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, COP21 is a huge priority for our ministers and for the UK government as well. We, you know, we really believe that, as well as all the important work that happens at national level, the stronger the international framework in support of climate change, the better, because it's the classic international challenge. So I would say that in terms of CCS and what COP21 could mean for CCS, in a way the biggest boost for CCS globally, I think, would be the kind of deal that we are aiming for, and that's one that is ambitious and sets the right level of ambition for future global action, that is has some structure underneath it in terms of monitoring and in terms of actually coming back to see what people are doing and taking the action that they said they would, and that is appropriate and balanced. So you know, those that need to take the greatest burden are doing so, but everyone is taking steps to the right degree. And then obviously there needs to be a whole program of support underneath that to allow different states, depending on where they are, to actually take the follow-up action. I think if we got that kind of deal, that would really focus national governments on what they needed to be doing. And given the huge prevalence of coal and gas, particularly coal in the global energy mix, you know, you quite quickly see that CCS is likely to be a really important technology globally. In addition, I would say we want to ensure that funding is available to support CCS projects, and our support for the Green Climate Fund and the other support mechanisms very much reflects that position.
Okay, great. I think I'm going to wind up. I'll try and squeeze in 2 questions in our last 5 minutes. The first one was about the structure of the UK government's demonstration, the UK government's commercialisation competition, okay. And it was a bit of a sort of 2-parter. So the first was, from your point of view, do you think that having the feed projects in competition has been difficult in terms of allowing them to share information and knowledge, and then also looking at, you know, the overall structure of the commercialisation competition and how the UK government has put it together? What was the thinking? How did you manage to make that happen, basically? What have been the key factors in allowing this focus on commercialisation as opposed to just demonstration for the UK?
Okay. Well, let me start with the first.
Complex.
No, they're really interesting questions, and let me start with the first one. I think at the moment when we selected 2 preferred bidders in the competition and signed feed contracts with them, we were committing to supporting them through their feed studies, so they, at that point, it's clear that the feed study can go ahead, that it's going to, subject to them meeting the terms of the contract as they go through, that should run its course with government support. And as I said, we built in a lot of knowledge transfer into that feed structure, which is starting to now bear fruit and be shared. It's quite true that in parallel to that, we are negotiating a contract for difference with them, because we don't want to kind of complete a feed study and only at that point start negotiating the things that will allow them and us to take a final investment decision, because that will just lengthen the process. So we are, we need to run those two parallel processes. Those negotiations, like with any commercial negotiation, they happen in confidence framework to give them the best chance of success. And it does mean that necessarily, if some of the information, those discussions is commercially sensitive and can't at this stage be shared. But I think that's just a byproduct of the nature of the beast of any commercial negotiation. So we've got a full commitment to sharing feed learning as soon as it's ready, and obviously subject to how the competition ends, we will hopefully have the first ever CFD that is bankable for a CCS project. We don't have it yet because those negotiations haven't finished yet, but when we do, I think that will be a really valuable resource for CCS developers and the financing community and all those who are trying to work out how commercial arrangements can be put in place to support CCS. So hopefully that that learning will come. There's just a need to allow the conversations to happen first to create that CFD. The structure of the competition is interesting. I mean, fundamentally, we believe that CCS is demonstrated. It's demonstrated all over the world. You've got commercial scale power plants in operation in Canada. You've got lots of, quite substantial demos of all sorts in various countries. And the challenge now is about commercialising in a UK context rather than further demonstration. And so the rationale for the competition was very much anchored around that rather than mere demonstration. And that was something that ministers very much signed up to, and that's in a sense what determined the scale of support that we've offered, which is obviously higher than would be warranted by a smaller demonstration project.
Thanks, Amy. And I think just one final question I'm going to squeeze in, and I'm really sorry because there are a few other questions that people have been asking, but I think it's just worth for the non-UK audience and for people who've been dialing in internationally who are really interested in how this is managed to get kicked off in the UK and how this policy regulatory framework is really developed. Amy, how important do you think having fairly consistent cross-party support for CCS technology has been for the development of CCS in the UK?
I mean, in a way, it would be interesting to ask the external CCS community and the developers that question, because certainly it reduces potentially the risk associated with the normal democratic process and governments changing, but you will always get changes of emphasis anyway, even if there is a basic commitment to trying to realise the potential of CCS. But no, on balance, I would say it is a good thing, and it's one of the things that I think makes the UK a positive place at the moment for CCS. But we're very much interested in engaging with other countries who, where there may be different, more polarised views, to share our understanding of how CCS is really critical, and the fact that our politicians, by and large, across the piece, have recognised that.
Great. Amy, thank you, and I'll share with you that there has been a little surge of activity since that final question, that people are, certainly UK people seem to be full-heartedly supporting that comment, that it really is critical. So I want to really close off today just thanking Amy, thanking everybody for making the effort to dial in today. Thank you for all the questions that have come in. I'm really sorry that we've not been able to get through everything. I will try and get some responses out to people where I can. There is going to be a little questionnaire at the end of the webinar. If you can take the time to fill it in, it just helps us to make sure that we get these webinars right and can continue to improve them in future. But I think other than that, I'd just really like to thank Amy for her time and for running through that so comprehensively about where the UK is. It certainly seems to be a really positive place, and hopefully there'll be some interesting developments towards the end of this year and into next that'll help CCS deployment globally as well as in the UK. So thanks so much, Amy, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.